When an operator working the land feels the drive wheels begin to lose traction, he can activate the John Deere differential lock valve. That locks the drive wheels together, helping the tractor regain traction. On John Deere row crop tractors, the differential lock is hydraulically activated. Pressing down on the differential lock pedal opens a valve and allows high-pressure oil to flow to the differential and lock it up. The differential lock valve on row crop tractors is located just below the right-hand side of the instrument panel. In this program, we'll show you the parts inside the differential lock valve, and we'll explain to you how it works. We'll also tell you how the valve regulates the pressure of oil flowing to the differential, and we'll show you how to adjust the differential lock valve to produce the correct pressure. This diagram shows how the differential lock valve is connected to the differential. When the pedal is up, the valve is closed, and oil in the line going to the differential is not under system pressure. Pushing the pedal down opens the valve, allowing high-pressure oil to flow to the differential. The pressure oil activates a piston and clutch mechanism in the differential, which locks the bevel pinions to the differential housing. The pedal for the 30 and 40 series four-wheel drive tractors is centrally located. When the pedal is depressed, oil flows to both front and rear differentials. The differential lock obviously needs a valve to turn the flow of oil on and off. But as we mentioned earlier, the differential lock valve also has to regulate the pressure of that oil flow. Why? Two reasons. First, there is leakage at the differential lock, which produces an oil flow. The valve has to work to keep pressure constant. Second, the differential lock does not require full hydraulic system pressure to operate. The differential lock valve keeps oil pressure at the differential lock at about 450 psi or 3100 kilopascal. Before getting into how the differential lock valve works, we'll show you its internal parts. On this cutaway housing, you can see the valve plunger. When the differential lock pedal is depressed, the actuator mechanism pushes the plunger into the valve bore. The plunger pushes on a heavy spring, which in turn pushes on the pressure control valve spool. There are several shims between the spring and the spool. The pressure control valve spool has an oil passage bored through it. The passage goes from one land to the spool's face. There's a spring on the other side of the spool too, and an elbow that screws into the housing. The oil line that goes to the differential attaches to that elbow. In the pressure oil inlet, there's a small pin that rides on the pressure control valve spool. There's also a check ball and spring in the pressure oil inlet. They're held in place by an elbow that attaches to the pressure oil line. Now that you've seen all the parts, we'll use a series of diagrams to show you how they work together. Here the differential lock valve is closed, so no oil flows to the differential lock. Notice that the pin is resting in the narrowest part of the land. This lets the check ball be seated, which blocks the high-pressure oil. Now see what happens when the valve is actuated. The plunger pushes against the spring. That spring is stiffer than the one on the other side of the spool, so it shifts the spool over. Also notice that as the spool moves, the pin rides up on the tapered edge of the land, and it unseats the check ball. As the spool continues to move through the bore, the pin rides down into the next land, but that land is wide enough to keep the check ball unseated. The valve is now open. Oil flows into the bore, through the passage in the spool, and out through the line going to the differential. When the differential lock is released, the plunger moves back and the spring on the right side of the spool moves it back to the closed position. The return line lets oil trapped by the spool land return to the hydraulic reservoir. Now you know how the valve works to turn the flow of oil on and off. But what about regulating pressure? To see how the valve performs that function, let's first take a closer look at the valve spool. Notice where oil exerts pressure on the spool. The pressure area within the spool land is much smaller than the area of the spool face. Because of the passage, oil pressure is equal on both sides. But force equals pressure times area. And since the face area on the right end of the spool is larger, the oil will exert more force on that end. So there are two sets of forces acting on the spool. The stiffer spring, plus the force generated by oil pressure on the valve land, act against the weaker spring, plus the force generated by oil pressure on the right end of the spool. When the oil pressure is low, the valve moves to the right. But as the oil pressure increases, the force exerted by oil pressure on the spool face overcomes the force on the other side of the spool, and it moves back to the left. The spool has a tapered land, so as it moves to the left, it starts to meter off the flow of oil through the valve. Because of this metering action, the oil pressure reaches a level that balances the forces on both sides of the spool. In this position, the valve is in a balanced state. It is designed so that the pressure will be about 450 psi, or 3,100 kilopascal. Now that you know how the valve regulates pressure, you've probably guessed how the valve can be adjusted. Adding shims to the valve increases the force that the stiffer spring will exert on the spool. Oil pressure will rise to equal that increased force. Decreasing the number of shims decreases the pressure of oil flowing to the differential lock. Follow instructions in the technical manual for actually adjusting the differential lock valve. Now that we've shown you how the valve works, let's move on to the linkage to the valve. On 30 and 40 series four-wheel drive tractors, the linkage is fairly simple. The operator presses the pedal to activate the differential lock. When he moves his foot off the pedal, the differential lock is deactivated. On row crop tractors, when the operator depresses the differential lock pedal, it stays down until the operator presses either of the brake pedals. Here's how that linkage works. In this position, the differential lock is off. Depressing the pedal pulls a pair of levers that push the plunger into the housing. Notice how those levers lock into place when the pedal is depressed. The levers are pulled over center by the pedal, and spring inside the valve pushes back out. The levers stay locked in the actuated position. The linkage between the pedal and the levers has a bracket on it with adjustable stops. Each brake pedal has a tab that matches up with the stops on the bracket. Depressing either of the brake pedals forces the linkage upwards, which releases the differential lock valve from its open position. And that's how the differential lock valve works. To review briefly, the differential lock on row crop and four-wheel drive tractors is hydraulically activated, and the differential lock valve controls the flow of oil to the differential. When the differential lock valve is in the off position, a check ball in the inlet keeps pressure oil from entering the valve. But when the valve is actuated, a pin unseats the check ball. Pressure oil flows through a passage in the valve spool and onto the differential lock. Because of the difference in area between the two parts of the valve spool, rising oil pressure forces the spool back to the left. With the differential lock valve activated, the metering land unseats the check ball and allows oil to flow to the differential lock. As hydraulic pressure becomes greater than the force exerted by the regulating spring, the valve shifts to the left and begins to meter the flow of oil to the differential lock. The valve is designed so that in this balanced position, oil pressure will be about 450 psi, or 3,100 kilopascal. The shims between the spring and the valve spool adjust the valve's pressure setting. The linkage on row crop tractors has an over-center locking mechanism, so that the pedal stays depressed even after the operator removes his foot. The linkage on 30 and 40 series four-wheel drive tractors is similar, but it will not go over center, so the operator must hold the pedal down as long as he wants the differential locks to function. Tabs on the brake pedals of the row crop tractor match up with the bracket and stops on the linkage. Pressing either of the brake pedals forces the linkage up and releases the valve back to a closed position. Four-wheel drive tractors do not require this linkage because the differential lock cannot be locked in the on position. By now, you should be more familiar with the differential lock valve. You should know its parts and how they work to control oil flow and oil pressure to the differential lock. You should also know how the linkage to the valve works. If you need more information about servicing the differential lock valve, check the technical manual.